Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for today's National Conference of State Legislatures webinar, What's the Outlook for Carbon Capture and Storage? My name is Kristen Hildreth, Policy Specialist for NCSL's Natural Resources and Infrastructure Committee, and I'll be your moderator for today. This is the first webinar in the committee's 2019 Spring Webinar Series. We have a total of 6 webinars lined up over the course of the next 7 weeks on a variety of topics, including on how states can prioritize traffic safety injury prevention strategies, how experts are attempting to avoid a patchwork of legislation within new transportation technologies, the future of plastic from production to disposal and the various policy options legislators are considering, the emerging regulatory and legislative landscape of cell-cultured meat, and the policies that are shaping the future of the nation's electric grid. For complete schedule and registration details, please visit our website at www.ncsl.org. Back to our focus today. Before I introduce our speakers, I wanted to quickly review a few housekeeping items. Today's webinar is a platform for information exchange and engagement. Over the next 60 minutes, we encourage participation through our chat box, so feel free to type your questions and answer any questions in the chat box, which is in the lower left-hand corner of your screen. To begin building some comfortability with the chat function and to also learn who is online today, I invite you to type in the state which you're calling in from now. We'll hold a formal Q&A after both presenters are finished presenting. Stated, our webinar today is being recorded, and registrants will be able to access a recording of the webinar in presentation slides on NCSL's website after the webinar completes. We'll send out a notice once those resources will be made available. Additionally, you can download the presentation slides being used today by clicking on the Resources tab and Speaker Bios in the Speaker tab at any time during the presentation. Now that the housekeeping is out of the way, let's get back to why we're here today. Although coal generation faces increasing economic, policy, and technological challenges, carbon capture and storage technologies, otherwise known as CCS technologies, may offer new opportunities for the coal sector. The technologies have the potential to decrease carbon emissions from coal and gas-fired power plants, provide economic benefits, and maintain fuel diversity and reliability. Due to high upfront costs and risks, the deployment of such technologies has been slow, but recent federal funding may change the dynamics. In 2018, Congress expanded CCS tax credits, and most recently, the Department of Energy announced $24 million in research grants for carbon capture technologies. During this hour, we'll discuss the current challenges for the technologies, as well as new opportunities for deployment. Joining us today are 2 speakers: Patrice, the president and owner of Riverwind Consulting and a program consultant to the Great Plains Institute on their carbon management team, and John Lisinski, the Carbon Capture Program Manager at the Department of Energy. First up, we have John. John currently serves as a Carbon Capture Program Manager in the Office of Fossil Energy. He's responsible for leading an applied research and development program focused on reducing the costs and risks associated with CCUS technologies. He previously served as a Technology Manager for Carbon Sequestration at the National Energy Technological Laboratory and as a Senior Team Lead on Environmental Compliance and Assessment with the U.S. Army. He has over 20 years of experience working on environmental compliance and technology development for the energy industry and the Department of Defense. John, thank you so much for joining us today. The floor is now yours.
All right. Thank you. I hope everybody can see my first slide. Again, thanks for the opportunity to talk today. Give you a little bit of an overview of what we're doing in CCUS within the Department of Energy, which is carbon capture, utilization, and storage. We're the main research and development organization within the department and within the federal government, but a lot of agencies are working on the topic related to regulatory compliance as well as some of the tax credits. But I'll talk specifically today about what we're doing in the research and development side. To start off, fossil energy is still, a major contributor to the energy industry in the United States. Over 80% of our energy that's used in the United States is in the form of natural gas, oil, or coal. Renewables and nuclear energy are also in the mix, and renewables over the last 10 years has gotten to be a growing share of the energy in the United States. But those renewables, even though that they are growing in the United States, there still is a need for backup power to those renewables as they are variable sources of energy. So I'll talk a little bit about the role that CCS technologies can play in helping to back up those renewables as we go through this presentation as well. As I mentioned, flexibility is key in our energy grid today. Over the last 10 years, as renewables have increased on the grid, the demands on our fossil energy plants to follow that demand and ramp up and down those very large power plants has increased. And this is just an example of, you can see kind of the power grid over the last few years and a few instances to show how the top blue line in the top graph, where wind was contributing a significant amount of the energy to a certain region of the country, and it dropped off significantly, and fossil energy plants had to ramp up very quickly to service that load. And again, the other graphs on the bottom show kind of the cyclical nature of solar power and wind power in different markets, and how fossil energy sources have had to ramp up and down to follow that load just to basically maintain electricity on the grid. So that's the reality of the new grid that we live in today. Any of the technologies that DOE is working on now need to understand that they're going to have to operate under these conditions. So the things that we're investing in on CCS technologies, we're inherently building in the fact that they're going to have to follow these renewable sources to make sure we have stable energy grid in the future, but also can deploy a low carbon fossil energy source. One of the main drivers, this is just background again, and I think Patrice will talk a lot more about this, but the 45Q tax credit has really seen a renewed interest in CCS technologies. The 45Q tax credits existed, but at a lower dollar value, and they were capped at a maximum threshold in terms of the number of tons that could be claimed. With the recent legislation, they increased the value of those tax credits, and they removed the cap on the number of tons. There's a time limit associated with it, and I think Patrice will get that into more of that. But this is one of those drivers that is driving investment in CCS, as well as how we're looking at the potential benefits of our R&D if we deploy CCS in the United States. What value those credits might bring to project developers. I wanted to highlight, we have invested in 3 very large demonstration facilities throughout the United States, which are operational. The first one, which became operational in 2013, is at the Air Products facility in Port Arthur, Texas. It's it's essentially a hydrogen production facility where there's a product of CO2 that's produced from the capture process of hydrogen. Approximately 1 million tons a year is separated, compressed, and then shipped down a pipeline to enhanced oil recovery. That's been operational since 2013. They've captured over 4 million tons and put that CO2 into oil fields. The second one is actually on a power plant. So in Thompson, Texas, the Petronova facility retrofitted one of their power plants where they take 240 megawatts equivalent of flue gas, capture 90% of the CO2, compress that CO2 and ship it 80 miles to an oil field for enhanced oil recovery. And again, under both circumstances, the CO2 is used to sweep oil out of these old reservoirs that would not be economic to continue producing oil normally, but they basically help sweep the oil out. Any of the CO2 that we inject into the reservoir is either recirculated and then ultimately stored in these reservoirs. And then the third project is the ADM ethanol facility. That became operational in 2017. During the ethanol process, they essentially emit pure CO2 from the fermenters to make corn ethanol. That CO2 is captured and is being injected into a deep saline formation. So they are injecting about 1 million tons a year as well in the middle of Illinois, in Decatur, Illinois. The also clean coal and carbon management is an introduction to us. We're really just focused on, developing new technologies for reliable fossil energy, specifically for coal, but a lot of the technologies that we develop are applicable to natural gas and oil-fired facilities. Some of the goals for the program is really focused on reducing the cost of capture. The current cost of capture is approximately $60 to $70 a ton. We would like to cut that cost down to $30 to $40 a ton to be competitive in the oil market for enhanced oil recovery, as well as under the value for the current tax credits for saline storage, which is approximately $50 a ton. Second area is we have a program in utilization of CO2, just really looking at converting CO2 to products such as plastics or that's redundant, plastics, polymers, chemicals, high-value chemicals, other building products, and possibly fuels. But really, there's a focus on, reducing the cost, making small modular units that could be deployed throughout the country, where the markets might need these materials that are produced. And then finally, we have a program in geologic storage, where we're looking at essentially reducing the risk of geologic storage and understanding what happens to the CO2 once we inject it into these geologic formations. All three of these programs are funded a total of about $200 million a year, and that's our current R&D budget. So approximately $100 million for capture, $10 million for utilization, and about $90 million for geologic storage. So carbon capture, where can you capture CO2? There's three main areas. One is the industrial sector, which is these bottom areas. You can get it from natural gas processing, ammonia plants, ethanol facilities, or cement plants. Those first three are really high purity sources. The CO2 comes out at over 90% pure, and you just need to dehydrate it, compress it, and either inject it for oil or store it in a saline formation. Cement plants, another industrial sector, coal-fired power plants or gas power plants. They burn their fuel in air, so it has a higher concentration, but not pure. So you need some kind of systems to separate it from the flue gas. And then finally, a lot of people have been talking about air capture. There's possibilities there if you need to reduce CO2 emissions or atmospheric CO2 and take that out of the atmosphere, but it gets more difficult as the concentrations get lower and lower and more expensive. Just because it's difficult to pull the CO2 out of a very dilute gas stream. The next slide just shows, kind of the successes of the program and kind of our strategy. We're really looking at, investing funding in, reducing the cost of energy required to get CO2 and reducing the capital cost. That means we look at a number of different technologies to improve the systems that separate CO2, from new materials like solvents or sorbents or membranes to the actual process equipment that the balance of plant, as we call it, that kind of you build around those materials that absorb and separate CO2 out of the flue gas. We've had a number of successes. We've had about 15 different types of technologies that we've advanced to the large pilot scale. And those technologies are going forward, and hopefully be commercialized in the next 5 years, maybe earlier. But they can, capture CO2 at about $40 a ton. So that's that bottom left graph that you see on the screen. Another major component of the program is what's called our National Carbon Capture Center. It's a test center near Wilsonville, Alabama, which is also home to Plant Gaston, which is an 800 megawatt coal-fired power plant. We've built a center over the last 10 years that can test novel technologies, including for CO2 capture and utilization. We've tested over 50 different technologies for over 100,000 hours of testing. We've got a staff of about 80 engineers that are just dedicated to help onboard developers and run their facilities and off-board, but we essentially get a good set of consistent data to evaluate the performance of all these technologies. Again, if anybody's interested in this, they do tours all the time. I'm sure they'd be willing to host anybody that's willing to see an actual capture facility in operation. We can host up to 10 different technology developers at one time. We usually typically have 4 to 5 on site at any one time. As I mentioned, we're starting to scale up technologies, and I apologize for a lot of the acronyms here, but one of the key components of the program is that we've scaled up these 5 developers to go to what's called the Test Center Mongstad in Norway. Why are you asking we're going to Norway? Well, it's because they're one of our countries that we collaborate with, but they've also built a very large test center. The National Carbon Capture Center that I showed at the last slide can test up to what's equivalent of like 1.5 megawatts, maybe 1 to 2% of the flue gas of a coal-fired power plant. This facility can test up to 10 times that size. So we're sending 5 technology developers over there under our bilateral arrangement with them. Norway operates the facility. We get the benefit of bringing our technology developers to test there. So we have 5 developers, Fluor, Research Triangle Institute, Membrane Technology Research, TDA, and Stanford Research Institute that have all developed very novel materials that we'll test over the next 2 years. And at that point, we hope they'll be ready for commercial uptake by industry. Another area that I think you might be interested in, because some of the states that I saw on the list have developers that are applying or have projects in their areas, we started funding commercial design studies. So a lot of the technologies coming out of our program are ready to be scaled up. So in the last year, a year and a half ago, we selected three technologies out of our program to actually do a feasibility study or a pre-feed study of a full-scale carbon capture system at 3 different power plants. There's basically 2 different solvents and a membrane, but there's one being developed at the East Bend Generating Station in Kentucky, another system being designed for the Milton R. Young Station in North Dakota, and the third at the Gerald Gentleman Station in Nebraska. Again, these are intended to be commercial design studies so that the next step that those stations or those power plants might want to do is start to look for financing to build these facilities. So those were pre-feed studies. We also just released a funding opportunity announcement that closes on it's issued on March 13th, closes on May 13th. Which is a full feed study. And a feed study is a front-end engineering and design study. This is a very detailed study where we'll get accurate cost estimates to within, plus minus 20 to 30%. And that will give us an idea. That actually will give a utility enough information that they could go to a bank and an investment community to say, we have enough detail and the risk is low enough that we should make an investment decision on that. Those close on May 13th. I know that many of the power plants in some of the states that were signed up for this WebEx, there are several power plants that will likely apply to this. So some of your stakeholders in your states might be interested in this as well. But the one area is to fund a project as a retrofit to an existing coal-fired power plant. Another project is to design a system for a new coal or gas-fired power plant. And then a third is design a capture system for an oxy combustion plant, where a power plant that just burns pure oxygen with CO2 and coal or gas. The next area is, I just want to talk, so that just touches on what we're doing in carbon capture. We probably have 60 projects ongoing, but those are some of the bigger initiatives that you might be interested in. The next area is carbon utilization. I just have one slide on that. We have a small program at about $12 million a year that we're looking at developing technologies that can convert CO2 to high-value chemicals, plastics, building materials, or fuels. We do that through 3 main ways: biological conversion, catalysis, where we take the CO2 and convert it on like a gold or a platinum or a low-cost metal catalyst to a fuel or a chemical. And then finally, we can take CO2 and directly make, react it with cements and make building products. So we have about 24 different active projects in that area, and we both have projects at the very early stage, as I mentioned, but also starting to fund some small pilot facilities. In our carbon storage program, it's approximately $100 million a year. This represents just the major areas of investment or parts of the program. One is the regional partnerships. This spans most of the United States, so I think anyone that's interested in CCS, there's 7 partnerships that are a resource for any of your stakeholders that you could contact. They really, over the last 10 years, they injected almost 10 million tons in different geologic formations in about 30 different projects in coal seams, oil fields, and saline formations. Carbon Safe is the next stage was kind of an offshoot of the regional partnerships to develop very large-scale storage facilities throughout the United States. We're also starting to look at offshore storage in the Gulf of Mexico and the East Coast, and then also looking at unconventional EOR. What happens when you inject into reservoirs like tight shales or tight oil and gas or coal bed methane seams or other unconventional reservoirs, and what happens to the CO2 in those reservoirs? Brine extraction storage test, you could inject CO2 and produce water to free up more space in these sandstone formations. So I'll talk a little bit more about a couple of those areas with just a few slides. One is Carbon Safe Initiative. As you can see from the slide, we're developing these large-scale facilities, and just preparing them for injection around the United States, where you could store about 50 million metric tons at each of these sites. Those would then be developed and ready and permitted, so that if any of the sources in the region that want to take advantage of those storage facilities could then contract with those or help develop those locations for storage. As I mentioned, in the offshore, there's probably, we've quantified that there's hundreds of years of storage opportunity on the onshore United States. There's probably 1,000 years of storage in the offshore, in these offshore oil and gas and saline formations. So we started with 2 projects to look at the East Coast, East Gulf, and the West Gulf states to characterize what the storage opportunities in those regions are. And then I have just one more slide on, what the opportunity, or why are we so interested in enhanced oil recovery? Enhanced oil recovery, there's a significant number of fields in the United States that could benefit from, more CO2 being available to produce additional oil, but also store CO2 in the process. We've estimated there's probably about 137 billion barrels of additional oil throughout the United States and 100+ billion barrels in unconventional tight oil, plus we haven't even quantified the offshore oil opportunity, but it could take a significant amount of CO2, what we estimate about 25 gigatons of CO2. But the bottom graph, and I think Patrice is going to talk about the pipeline map, because building pipelines infrastructure is a key element of this program to going forward. But the bottom graph actually is important to us, is that the left portion of that graph just represents oil production of a field that is no longer in primary production. When you start injecting CO2, you can see the amount of oil that increases in the field because you're basically using that CO2 as a solvent to sweep more oil out of these reservoirs. So there's a huge economic opportunity in the United States if we can get more CO2 available using CCS, kind of as a bridge for future low carbon fossil fuels. So again, I thank you for the opportunity to speak. I just wanted to highlight a few of the resources that are available either through DOE's website or NETL's website. We have a carbon storage atlas. We have what we call the National Risk Assessment Partnership, and then we have a database of all the reports and kind of data that we collect that might be interested to some of your stakeholders. Again, thank you for your time. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you, John. It's great to hear about the work that DOE is doing and the projects that are currently ongoing in some of these states. Our second speaker today, Patrice, is a program consultant to the Great Plains Institute on the carbon management team and helps facilitate several initiatives, including the State Carbon Capture Workgroup, Mid-Continent Power Sector Collaborative, Regional Carbon Capture Deployment Initiative, and the National Carbon Capture Coalition. She has 20 years of experience in agriculture and energy policy and has led the Policy and Communications divisions at the North Dakota Department of Agriculture for more than a decade. Energy development and carbon management has been a significant focus of her professional work, having led the effort to organize the first Renewable Energy Summit in North Dakota in 2003. She's also served as the elected chair of the North Dakota Alliance for Renewable Energy from 2009 to 2012, and was originally elected to the board of directors in 2008. Patrice, thank you so much for joining us today. The floor is now yours.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a little bit about the Great Plains Institute. It is an independent nonprofit organization focused on energy policy and technology, primary goal being to transform our energy system to benefit both the economy and the environment. And so, as was said in the introduction, I work with the Great Plains Institute on their carbon management program, and we'll get into that a little bit more here. As John very eloquently described, carbon capture and the technology has been around for a long time, with the first project happening in the early 70s in Texas. And John highlighted a couple of the more recent projects, but certainly there is commercial experience in the realm of carbon capture. And carbon capture is a very scalable and viable option. It delivers domestic energy production, jobs, and emissions benefits. EOR accounts for approximately 4% of our domestic oil production. Saline storage has been demonstrated at scale. John pointed out the ADM project, for example, in Illinois. And there's direct economic benefits. I live and work in North Dakota. We are a commodity-driven state, both heavy energy and agricultural resources. And by figuring out solutions that, reduce emissions and decarbonize some of our fossil energy resources will really help to preserve a lot of the high-paying and highly skilled jobs that we have across the value chain in domestic energy production. So to that end, the Great Plains Institute has a lot of different elements to the carbon management program, and I'm going to touch on three of them that are listed on this slide today. So on the national level, we help to facilitate and staff the Carbon Capture Coalition, and it's essentially the trade organization for carbon capture nationally. It started off in 2011 as the National Enhanced Oil Recovery Initiative and rebranded last year to the Carbon Capture Coalition for reasons of a broadened focus beyond EOR. And it happened to fall in line very well with the passage of the reformed 45Q tax credit. And that national coalition also has developed a new Carbon Capture Leadership Council. We have CEOs and leaders of major organizations and companies that are really coalescing around this issue and working with us to try to make policy changes and make things happen. And then GPI also works at both the regional and state level. So the State Carbon Capture Workgroup, which I will talk about in a few minutes, was convened in 2015 by the governors of Wyoming and Montana, and then also the Regional Deployment Initiative, which is an offshoot of that. I'm going to talk a little bit more, though, about the Carbon Capture Coalition. Very diverse membership that spans the political spectrum, spans the spectrum as far as non-government organizations, small companies, large companies, oil producers, ethanol producers, really the whole gamut. And, it's kind of an unlikely group to all get behind something, and usually it's forum members. It's not always for the same reasons, but the coalition has really united many diverse interests, and the membership has grown significantly over the past year and a half. And some of the reason for the coalition's growth was the fact that the coalition was able to reach sort of its signature accomplishment from a policy perspective, and that is the reform of the federal 45Q tax credit. And that was passed as part of the Bipartisan Budget Act in 2018. And it was officially titled the Future Act. It was introduced by a quarter of the United States Senate, Democrats, Republicans, one independent. And you had, lead sponsors, that then Senator Heitkamp at the time in North Dakota, Capito from West Virginia, Whitehouse, Barrasso, Graham, and Kane. And then the House of Representatives, we were fortunate enough to have 50 co-sponsors of the legislation. So, it was really, it was an exciting process to be a part of, and really, it was great to see, and sort of the state we live in right now of great political divide and tension, to be able to see all sides of the aisle wrap their arms around something and get something meaningful done. As far as the provisions of 45Q reform, John touched on some of this earlier. So the tax credit value increased in 3 different categories. So from $10 to $35 for enhanced oil recovery, $20 to $50 for saline storage or storage in geologic formations, and then from $10 to $35 for emissions that are reduced through beneficial use. So that could be, carbon dioxide that's used to make fuels or chemicals, those types of things. So the tax credit does have a time window, however. So construction has to commence within a relatively short 6-year window, and then there's 12 years once that construction period starts in order to claim the credit. And we'll touch on this a little bit more later, but the tax credit was passed as part of the Budget Act in February of 2018, and the Department of Treasury, unfortunately, has yet to act to issue guidance or further instruction to taxpayers clarifying exactly what that means for them. And so there's been a lot of uncertainty, a lot of project developers and others who are very interested in moving things forward, but because there's no official word from the Department of Treasury, things are at sort of a standstill. So in the realm of energy technology and energy projects, 6 years is really not a long time. And so it's concerning knowing that project developers only have until the end of 2023 currently to break ground on projects. So looking at the federal policy agenda going forward, so 45Q is certainly a foundational policy mechanism to drive carbon capture in the marketplace and to drive projects. So one of the key objectives for the Carbon Capture Coalition is again, to make sure that the Department of Treasury correctly implements 45Q. We need to provide investment certainty and flexibility for the business community. The Carbon Capture Coalition spent several months last year working with tax attorneys and others, and submitted model guidance to the Department of Treasury for their consideration, addressing some of the ins and outs and the details that would be needed to ensure, again, that investment certainty and flexibility for projects. The coalition is also, the tax credit's foundational. However, there still are challenges with respect to deploying carbon capture projects. And so we continue to research and look at potential additional incentives that could complement 45Q. And as John alluded to in his presentation, obviously the build out of infrastructure for CO2 is going to be critical. And so we've been focused on what carbon dioxide pipeline infrastructure looks like, how that fits into the national conversation on infrastructure legislation and that sort of thing. And then we also fully support, what John and DOE are doing as far as research and those types of things. And so we support RDD&D, and just recently sent a letter to congressional leaders outlining our support and appropriations requests for the coming year. The coalition is also in the process of developing a more formal policy blueprint, really taking a deep dive, thinking ahead several years on what we actually need to achieve economy-wide deployment of carbon capture, hopefully within 10 years' time. And so the blueprint, which is under development right now and will be released in May, has 4 main categories of creating that investment certainty, looking at technology deployment and the cost reductions that we need to see, infrastructure deployment, and then project finance and feasibility. And again, stay tuned. We'll be releasing more information and the policy blueprint in middle to late May. Shifting gears a little bit, GPI also staffs a state carbon capture work group. And as I mentioned at the outset, this group was convened by then Governor Matt Mead in Wyoming and Governor Steve Bullock in Montana. It launched in 2015. The map on the right side of the screen depicts the 15 states that are currently participating. We are in active conversations with several additional states to join that work group. And when the project launched in 2015, one of the primary objectives was to help policymakers at the state level better understand what the potential was on the state level for carbon capture, and then to come to the point where they're able to recommend state and federal policies and strategies to support the industry, and then obviously get to the point where projects are being developed and underway. And so in 2016, the work group released a comprehensive report of both federal and state policy recommendations, and then went on to craft 3 work products, 3 white papers on the topics of infrastructure build-out, the opportunity of ethanol and carbon capture, and then also electricity market design. And after they went through that shared learning process together, Governors Mead and Bullock said, okay, we've learned what we need to learn. And then shortly after, the release of all those papers, the federal tax credit passed. And the governor said, we need to shift gears and we need to focus on deployment. We need to move from, collective learning to actually getting steel in the ground. And so that led to the development of the Regional Carbon Capture Deployment Initiative. Governor Mead invited 17 governors to have their states participate. And it's focused in 2 regions, in the Midwest and in the western part of the country. And the goal of the Regional Carbon Capture Deployment Initiative is really to conduct to take a lot of the work that the regional partnerships that John mentioned in his presentation, sort of bring some of that to the next level and look at the mapping of sources and sinks, look at the costs of carbon capture, and then start thinking through pipeline modeling and what all of that might look like. So we convened state officials and stakeholders in the Midwestern and Western regions. We showed them some initial analytical work and modeling and got their feedback and comments on all of that. And we're continuing with that process. I'll show you a couple of maps here in a minute that sort of depict the work that we're doing. And so we completed the first 2 phases of the project, and the 3rd phase is underway. So we're refining our modeling at this point. We're looking at various policies, both on the state and federal level, that might close cost gaps for projects. We're trying to identify early mover projects and some of that low-hanging fruit in each of the regions. And then we are, really looking to do some on-the-ground work in various states in those two regions in the 2020 legislative sessions, looking at state policies and best practices that could potentially be implemented that will really help complete the picture with, 45Q is the main policy, but what are the other complementary things we can do to really drive these projects to viability in these two regions. So this is the modeling that was conducted in 2016 by the state work group. We went through an exercise of thinking through what major pipeline corridors might look like nationally for carbon dioxide pipelines. And that has evolved into the map that you see here. So this was also in John's slide. So this is the most recent modeling scenario. You can see the legend on the bottom right. If you look in the Midwest, you look at all of the ethanol concentration across the Midwest. As John pointed out, ethanol has a very high purity stream of CO2. So how do you move, capture and move that CO2 down through pipeline networks where it can be used in places like the Permian Basin in Texas? And so we're continuing to refine our modeling and our thinking, the cost assumptions and all of those things, and hope to be finalizing a lot of that modeling here in this next summer. And so, as I said, the group will be finalizing analytical work coming up in the next few months. We'll be undertaking a state policy inventory exercise in both the Midwest and the Western regions, and we'll probably be reaching out to NCSL to see what sort of resources you already have in that regard. The stakeholder groups in both regions are forming policy development teams to actively work on all of this. And then, what we really want to provide states is sort of a policy checklist and examples of best practices that might be workable in individual states, understanding that each, and every state is different. And so then by hopefully 2020, which isn't too far off anymore, we will be working in several states on legislation or regulatory action or both. So that's kind of the overview that I had today. I appreciate the opportunity to be here and would be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Patrice. I think all of that was really helpful and informative, and hope that we are able to help you in your work on compiling what states are currently doing. I'd like to now shift gears to our final portion of today's webinar, question and answer. We have some time left, so any questions that aren't able to be answered on today's webinar will be answered via email. If you have any questions, please type them in the box. And as a reminder, the webinar is being recorded and will be made available to all participants. So I guess one of the first questions, given that our audience today, a lot of them are state legislators or legislative staff, what role do you see state policymakers playing for wanting to support the growth of these technologies?
This is Patrice. I guess I can go first. I would say to date what we've looked at is I think there's a lot of room for meaningful contributions if state tax policies are optimized. And what that looks like, each individual state, again, is different. So we undertook an exercise in 2016, sort of collecting all that information. We need to update all of that. But off the top of my head, that's really one of the first places I think states could look. I would also be happy to share with you a report that the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners, NARUC, completed with their Clean Coal Subcommittee. And they had some, very specific recommendations for states. That was more in the realm of what public utility commissions could do, but it might be useful just as a learning tool for legislators, and depending on the governance in states, there may be some things that are applicable there. So yeah, that's where I'd start.
you. Do we see other countries implementing these technologies and these projects, and are there any lessons learned from them that could be applied in the United States?
Yeah, this is John Latinsky. So there are a number of countries that are, either very supportive or actually putting in projects in place. And what's good is we have a number of bilateral agreements between the United States and some of those countries to actually share information. So just a couple that are, of specific interest. Canada, obviously, is one of our biggest trading partners, and with that, there's actually projects in Canada that have been developed. It's called the Quest projects, and then a long-term project, just north of the border, North Dakota, where they're doing enhanced oil recovery and saline storage. There's also a facility where they're doing capture from a coal-fired power plant at Boundary Dam. And again, we've found lots of opportunities to discuss the lessons learned between their projects and our projects in the United States, and some of that relationship and exchange ideas. Another country that's very active is Norway, and I showed the one slide where we've been able to leverage their test facility, but very early on, Norway had a fee for CO2 emissions from natural gas operations in the North Sea. So Statoil, now Equinor, developed a project called Sleipner, where they injected 1 million tons a year for more than 20 years now in the North Sea. And we collaborated with them on research to monitor the CO2, and then we have a bilateral with them, again, to share information, share data, put our researchers in the industry in contact with theirs. So that's another good example. And then there's other countries throughout the world that are looking at developing projects. Australia has one of the largest projects that's going to be developed and come online in the world very soon. Japan is very active. China is very active. There's dozens of countries that are really interested in this because they recognize it's very difficult to have a grid without fossil energy, or to have an industrial sector that's carbon-free without having CCS technologies.
Great, thank you. I think that leads into...
This is Patrice.
Yeah, Patrice, go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to add to that. I agree, all with what John summarized and shared. I think the one thing that is interesting, though, is from a policy perspective, I think the globe is really watching the U.S. right now with the passage of 45Q, and they're really watching to see how we implement that, what it means for the industry here. So that's something to consider.
Yeah, I'll add to that. The United States is clear. You're right, Patrice. Is clearly the leader in this. We've done more than anybody else in the last 40 years on CO2 storage and injection.
So it's great to know that we're being watched on this. I guess it kind of leads into my next question. John, you touched on it a little bit about how countries are realizing that they need some sort of a fossil base in their energy portfolio. I think we've heard some talk about these technologies being critical as an interim solution as some countries try to meet their 100% renewable energy goals. What would you say to that, as CCS being characterized as an interim solution?
It really depends on the country and their conditions, but I think from our point of view, CCS is critical in the long term, and it is interim, but it's also an interim to a transition. I think of if you're going to bring more and more renewables onto the grid, they come with the challenge that they do fluctuate on the grid significantly, and they're dependent upon weather conditions, and so they have to be backed up by another source. And the only sources right now, and probably in the near future, that can really follow kind of those fluctuations are natural gas and coal-fired power plants. They're really the ones that are making up the lion's share of creating a stable grid. But if you're going to do that, you're going to need CCS on those plants as well. So the challenge is energy storage. But having long-term energy storage is also a challenge. So we don't see we don't see it as as kind of an interim. We see it as a CCS on coal-fired power plants is going to be a necessity, if we want to deploy more renewables and have a kind of a low carbon energy grid.
And this is Patrice, and I would agree with that. And if you think about energy projects and energy investments at large, utilities are making decisions for spans of decades. So I think to look at this as just a shorter term or interim solution isn't the right way to approach it.
Thanks for that. And then I guess one last question we have before we kind of wrap the webinar up. Congress has funded R&D efforts surrounding these technologies since, I believe it was 97, and has consistently increased their funding. Do we think that trend will continue?
Probably not the one to comment on funding levels.
Yeah.
What I would say is I think in the program we've seen that we're getting close to commercialization of a number of these technologies, and whether that's the cost is borne by the federal government or cost by industry, that's kind of out of my hands. So
yeah.
I would say from the perspective of the Carbon Capture Coalition, we certainly support robust funding in this area, and beyond retrofits or things specific to new coal plant builds with carbon capture and those types of things, also expanding the research appropriations to look more carefully at direct air capture and utilization more broadly.
Great. Thank you both. I would just like to go ahead and extend a final thank you to both of you, both John and Patrice. We greatly appreciate the expertise that each of you were able to provide. And of course, thank you to our attendees for participating in today's webinar. A recording of it will be available shortly after and will be emailed around to all of those registered. Our next webinar will be in 2 weeks, focusing on how states can prioritize traffic safety injury prevention strategies and the latest legislative trends related to such interventions. To register and to find out more information on that, please visit ncsl.org or contact me. My email's up on the screen. Again, thank you for your continued interest and support of NCSL, and have a great day. Thank you both again.
Yep, thank you.
Thanks.